first panelist, Stephen Kidd, who is joining us via Skype. And Stephen is the Director and Senior Policy Specialist from Development Pathways. The floor is yours, Stephen. You have 15 minutes.
So what I thought I'd look at first was really to focus on the evidence on graduation programs. I think a lot is said about the success of these programs, but I thought it'd be good to go back to the actual evaluation documents that have been done. There's been some quite good evaluations, or there's been quite good evaluation done, and look at what it actually says in terms of the results. So we go on to the first slide. I think the first question is, are graduation programs social protection? Well, actually, I think they're not. I think really the transfers that you get, the regular predictable transfers that you get, seem to be only for around 10 months. Then families are removed from the transfer and therefore exposed to risks without any basic income security. And in a country like Bangladesh, many of these people are not on any other social security programs. So the graduation support is not provided by the state. It's really just NGO initiatives out in Bangladesh around the world. And they're much better really just conceptualized as more or less traditional micro-enterprise or livestock schemes. I think we've been doing them for many, many decades. In fact, I wrote a program in Paraguay when I lived there for 120 years ago. It was doing something very, very similar to the graduation programs nowadays. If you go, this is the slide from BRAC showing the kind of model that they have, whereby you select families or women that are ultra poor, you give them some regular transfer and support, provide them the skills, you give them an asset, which is generally cows or goats, and from that they're meant to graduate from extreme poverty to poverty, upwards and onwards, forever graduating and really doing well without any additional support. I think a lot of the information that comes out around graduation schemes tends to show how well they're doing. This is a slide from the group that's been doing the evaluation, the International Growth Center, where you can sort of see at the top the sort of increases in expenditure that you get from the program. And this is showing the second bits along in the right on the purple, sort of the impacts you might get, an increase in household expenditures after 4 years, which seems to be substantial, around $500. So in fact, what's not to like about this? It seems fantastic, $500 to get up there, but actually what do the evaluations really tell us when we look at them in more detail? I think one thing to look at is it's interesting, while these are meant to be the BRAC graduation programs called targeting the ultra poor, it's interesting to see how many women who are actually on the program are in fact ultra poor. The ultra poor are meant to be about the poorest 6% of the population. Now, Bangladesh at the time when the program started in 2007, the poverty line was set at around $1.25 a day. Around 40% of households nationally were under $1.25 in 2007. So you would expect that the ultra poor would be right at the bottom of those 40%, right at the bottom. In fact, the evaluations show that 47 of the ultra poor households, the supposed ultra poor households, in the graduation program in 2007 were in consumption terms, as they measured it, actually not poor. They were above the line. They were in the top 60% of the population. So in terms of consumption, they weren't ultra poor. There may have been certain other characteristics which meant that BRAC identified them as apparently ultra poor, but in terms of consumption, they were doing relatively well, many of them, compared to the rest of the population. And in fact, it's probable, although we don't have enough information from that very few of the beneficiaries of the graduation programs were actually in the poorest 6% of the population in Bangladesh. So it's questionable whether they were in fact the real ultra poor in Bangladesh. Now the impacts, it seems to me, it really depends on how you want to present them. So I've tried to go back to look at the original evaluations to see the kind of the results, and I have on the left the kind of results that are often put out, what I call the wow factor, the ones that we are meant to show how well it's doing. And then the ones on the right are sort of my analysis trying to understand actually what was the real impact. So I'll just go through a few of them. We often hear that earnings increase amongst women by 37%. So it sounds very impressive, but if you look at the actual results, it seems to be that only means $1.83 or $2 a month, not even a day, $2 a month, $24 or $24 a year, which is very little. Consumption, we are told, increased by 10% amongst households. But in fact, if you look at how low the consumption was, consumption in fact increased by about $1.38 a month. Again, a very, very small amount. I should just say I'm giving these values in 2007 US dollar nominal values, so we get a sense of what the real size of the changes were. We hear again from, we're told value of household durables increased by 110%, which sounds very impressive, but in fact that seems to translate into just value increasing of $9.90, which sounds a lot less impressive. The value of the cows, net of the transfers, increased by 208%, which sounds great, until you look at it and it seems that actually translates into something like around $10, the increase in the value of the cows. Household savings increased by an incredible 863%. But when you look at the data, it seems that actually just means $13, because the actual household savings were so small. And the hours of work increased by 22.4%, which sounds great, women were working more, but when you look at how much income they got per hour, it was only about 10 cents, 10 US cents an hour, which is a tiny little income from all this extra work that they were doing. So I think we can look at the different results and how they're presented, and I think there's a challenge on how they're presented and make us think that this has been a great program with, as the advocates would say, transformative. When you look at the other numbers in terms of how it really increased or benefited people, the numbers seem a lot less impressive. I think it's also interesting, but we don't really have the clear information to see which beneficiaries perform best. Well, we're told that the ultra-poor, but as we know, almost half of them weren't actually poor at the time of getting onto the program. Now, the latest evaluation says the effect on consumption is 10 times larger at the 95th and at the 5th centile, and differences for savings and productive assets are even larger. And it would be interesting to know whether, and it's unclear whether this just means that the largest impacts were actually on the non-poor, and that there were much more limited impacts on the ultra-poor, but I'm not clear on that. I can just give you the quotation from the evaluation. I think in the 2016 evaluation document by Van Diera et al., they also say, look at the compare the impacts of other similar schemes in other countries where they have very small schemes, but much smaller scale than Bangladesh, and their conclusion is it's striking how similar the pattern of effects is across the broad set of 10 outcome variables. And that's meant to say, well, they were impressive, but in fact, if they were as unimpressive as perhaps the real impacts of the graduation program in Bangladesh, perhaps it means that really across the world, none of these programs are performing as well as we might be led to believe. So look at the cost versus benefits. I'm not 100% certain on the cost. We're told it's around $300 a year. It's a 2-year program, so let's assume $600 per household is how much it costs over the 2 years to put a family through that program. Now, looking at the increase in household incomes, that would mean it would take 27 years for the cumulative increase in household incomes to reach $600, assuming that was the same level of income that they were getting over that time. It may go up, but it's more likely perhaps with people hit by a shock to go down. So it may actually take a lot longer to recover the costs. Would there have been alternative uses of this money? I think in the 2012 evaluation there was an attempt done to see what if we put the money into a bank at 6% annual interest, which was the rate that you could have got at the time in Bangladesh. And they did that on the basis of just 1 year's cost. It was done at $600. That would have given a 6% annual interest based on the type of analysis that the evaluation team did in Bangladesh. That would give you a lifetime annual income of $36, which is actually better than the $22 you're getting from all this additional work that you do in taking care of goats and cows. You could also, another option would have been just to give the beneficiaries $5 a month for 10 years. That would have cost $600. And given that we know many other unconditional programs around the world have very significant impacts. Even I've been working in old age pension in Uganda, where we've seen significant increases in livestock, in terms of particularly goats, but also cattle, chickens, etc. Just the transfer of $7.50 to older people over 65. That might have been a better alternative, but of course, each month, the beneficiaries would have been getting around 3 times the increase in income that they actually got from the graduation program, but they wouldn't have had the same increase in assets. So, looking at the evidence, I think the big question is, does the BRAC graduation program actually enable ultra-poor households to graduate sustainably out of extreme poverty, which is the objective of the program? Of course, the answer is, well, already half of the beneficiary households weren't even poor when they started the programs. In effect, they already graduated by the time that they started. Secondly, the program impacts appear to be very, very small, and probably smallest amongst the ultra-poor, that the majority of poor families are unable to sustainably graduate out of poverty with this very small level of increase in income and consumption. And of course, if the families are unable to access conventional social security benefits such as child benefits or old age pensions, etc., then they're likely to fall backwards anyway if they're hit by a shock such as ill health, death of animals, drought, etc. So they have no security, because once they're off the transfer, they're left alone and subject to all of this risk, which may lead them to falling back into or falling backwards to where they were perhaps when they started the program, or even lower. I think we need to see, which is more realistic. Now, is it the BRAC model on the left, where everyone is going upwards and onwards and ever onwards, improving, or is it more realistic, the diagram I put on the right, where even if we were accurately targeting and selecting people, we got people just before the poverty line, the actual increase in income is much less impressive. Our consumption now, we're total only 10%. And then when you get taken off the program, what's your likely trajectory? Now, I'm sure some of the women on the program are much more entrepreneurial and will do a lot better, and they'll go onwards and do well. Others will just potter along, and they may be protected from some kind of risk, or they may get lucky. They may be on the BRAC health program, I think, which is going to give them some free access to health, actually included in the cost. And many others will be hit by a shock, and as we know, will go and fall back down. And realistically, rather than giving the impression that all these women are going to graduate, a more realistic scenario might be, perhaps we have, success rates of 10, 20% of women doing a lot better. That's more realistic, what we might expect from a micro-enterprise or program. So, just to give a further reality check on this is I won't go into this, but this is just giving an example of a program in the United Kingdom trying to get people into permanent jobs, where private sector schemes are giving $21,000 US if one of the unemployed gets into a permanent job, and the actual target of success there is only 5.5% of the unemployed who are on the program, and out of that, the actual success was only 3.5%. These things of getting people into work on social security benefits are really difficult, and the success rates are going to be much lower than we're often told by some of the programs that are promoted in developing countries. And the beliefs underpinning the graduation inclusive social protection models. I think we have two very different approaches. For me, the graduation model is very much the traditional heroic individual model of development, where each individual or family by themselves strives to get out of poverty with a little bit of support from to help them into the labour market or into small enterprise, while the state has no engagement, it just looks on. And I think really this core graduation model is no different to really many of the livestock programs for poor farmers that we've seen around the world for many decades, where the state hasn't really seemed to have much of a role. Whereas an inclusive social protection system, the one where I guess the world moved more to in terms of rights and entitlements, and looking at issues around social injustice and the need for redistribution within society, is about ensuring that individuals and families have access to core social security schemes provided by the states, such as old age pensions, disability benefits, and child benefits. And then to those that are on it who have capacity to work, we provide them with additional labour market support, but without removing families from the benefits, because they're highly likely to get out of poverty. You just got to bear in mind, in Bangladesh, over 80% of the population lives on less than $2 a day in purchasing power parity terms. People aren't getting out of poverty in Bangladesh. They need absolute support from a national social security system, and it would be much better for organisations like BRAC to get right behind the national social security strategy in Bangladesh, which is out to ensure that poor women or women in poverty and single women have access to allowances that are much higher than the kind of incomes they will get from the graduation programme. So I think what we need to be looking at is the situation where we have social security recipients of benefits being given a whole range of support by the state and by others to be able to do better, become more resilient, but without thinking that we have to remove them from social security. The key thing is to get families onto social security, just as most of us have been on in developed countries, and give them additional support as well to get into the labour market and do a lot better out of that. So, I think, the question is, do we ever get into many of these other myths that have been created around social protection, such as the myth that poverty targeting is good for the poor, or the myth that it's possible to accurately target the poor, a range of other myths such as Bolsa Familia, Brazil's largest social protection scheme, and has the main impacts on poverty and inequality. These are all myths which have not very strong basis in reality. And is this yet another myth that graduation programs really enable ultra-poor families to sustainably escape from poverty? I really don't think we have the evidence there that they do that. The only real solution is to have an effective national social security system in place, and then perhaps give some of the women some additional labour market support. In conclusion then, in the final slide, I'd say the graduation program is great to give women, especially women living in poverty, a few goats, a cow. I mean, nobody's going to be against that, but that's not a magic bullet. We've been doing that for years and it's failed, and the impacts from themselves will be relatively minimal. The key thing is to provide a regular, predictable social security transfer to families and give them additional support to get into the labour markets. And I think donors should really look at the actual evidence from the evaluation reports that BRAC themselves have produced before they take decisions on whether this is the best use of their own taxpayers' money as they're investing in programs, or perhaps look at other things like, for example, as DFID is doing in Bangladesh, trying to really enable the state to set up a proper national social security system, and that's the only way that we'll really get transformative change.